All right, we're in progress. I'm thinking of that as the name, recording in progress. It's
Wow,
probably been
I thought you were
taken.
joking.
No, I'm serious.
I
I've actually named
uh-huh.
it in
Um,
I've actually named
okay,
it
great.
uh in YouTube in my YouTube channel. It's called Words and Phrases because I couldn't think of anything else to name it and it had to have a name. So that's the podcast that it will be dropped into
Mm-hmm.
once it's recorded. And once we have 50 followers, which I think we're going to have to make like 47 of those ourselves. But once we have 50 followers, we can just record it live straight from YouTube. But it starts out
That'll be
here on Zoom.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Do you want to
Um,
start with the section we had talked about where we update each other on our writing progress?
sure. You want to go first?
Sure. I mean, we just had like a long vacation where we were doing a lot of stuff, and I would say that I did not get a lot of writing done. I actually didn't get any done. I didn't even touch the little document that I use to write. Um, the one thing that is happening though is a lot of progress has been made on me getting an advisor for the master's degree, and I have a really interesting advisor. It's not any of the ones that we had on that we were looking at before. Um, it's not anyone that I think you would have heard of before. It's a lady who is like a specialist in flash fiction, which is like not what I was expecting, but it makes a lot of sense for the project that I'm working on. Like what I'm doing right now is very much like flash fiction adjacent. And so having someone who has sort of specialized in flash fiction makes sense. I feel a little bit I have mixed feelings about it because on the one hand, like undeniably what I'm doing is flash fiction adjacent. And I do also think that flash fiction is a really interesting format, but I'm also like at the same time, like kind of I think the prevalence of flash fiction primarily comes from people just being too busy to read for real. And like I don't think that undermines the format uh, inherently. But I do think that the seeing it emerge as a more and more like dominant genre in writing, and just knowing that the reason for that is because nobody has more than like 45 seconds at a time where they can
Yeah.
focus on reading and writing. Um, I don't know, it really just pisses me off. And now I am going to be participating in this, illustrious tradition of killing literature, making it more compatible with being constantly distracted. And
So,
yeah, that's
so
my situation.
I have recently read over 1,000 pieces of flash fiction in the past couple of
Mhm.
months, and by that
Yeah,
I
for
mean,
the competition, for the Story
yeah,
Street
for yeah, I
competition.
judged the first rounds of both competitions. Other people judged some, but I judged almost all of the first round, so much so that they didn't want me to judge the second round at all. And that was over 1,000 short pieces. And man, I think like uh, it's a real pain in the butt to be a crappy writer and write, you know, a 5,000 word story because it's a lot of words. But to be a crappy writer and write a piece of flash fiction, it's easier. And I think that's part of why flash fiction is so popular now is so many people are trying to write it. Some people are discovering writers. Some people are figuring out that they're not writers by writing flash fiction. But some people are discovering themselves in the format. And
Mhm.
and you know, I'm talking about the supply side and you're talking about the demand side. And I'm sure it's a combination of the two. Uh
Not quite how I would put it.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying actually sounds like a benefit to me. Like if it's a format that people can, begin writing with like a relatively like minimal time investment, minimal, you can imagine someone who's never written before but who's familiar with the concept of flash fiction, just getting like bored on their lunch break and trying their hand at it. Like I think that's great. But on the
Yeah, and
reader
it's
side, the idea, uh-huh.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
On the reader side, the idea of someone whose like primary engagement with literature is reading these like 45-second pieces, it just makes me scream inside.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's there's several things that are already coming up about the craft reading today. The craft of reading that we're going to talk about is is reading like a writer, Francine prose. It's the first paragraph, the first chapter, and um, one of the things that she talks about at the beginning of the first chapter is that we all begin as a certain type of reader, and that's a close reader because we're trying to puzzle through, see Dick chase Jane through the monkey bars. We're trying to puzzle through that sentence and figure out what it means at the age of 4 or 5 or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
and we all
Hmm.
start as close readers, and we all start figuring out sentences that way. And then we get good enough at the mechanics, and we quit paying attention to the atoms of a text and just blast through it for what story is being told. And I think that's like the short fiction is really good for taking an adult who wants to be a writer and bringing their mind back to that construction part of sentences and paragraphs, because it's so hard to say very much in, you know, a single page. It's hard to tell a story in a single page. You have to be crisp and careful with the language and evocative, um, to get a rich story. And so from the, I don't know, 1,500 uh, short pieces I read over the past few months, the best ones are the ones that have the best sentences. And it's not because I worship at the altar of the sentence. I kind of do, but it's not because I worship. I tell myself it's not because I worship at the altar of the sentence. It's because if you've only got 100 words or 250 words, uh, your sentences need to say a lot without using very many words. And so
Hmm.
we're really, it really helps focus on language. It creates the shorter pieces create this density of the utility of language that I think is a good writing lesson for people who are trying to be, you know, writers now. And it's also a way to, um, you know, sort of take us back to our beginnings, uh, take the writer in us back to our beginnings as a close reader. And that's the premise of the craft book that we're going to talk about, is that there are a lot of ways to learn writing, but
Okay.
the most common is by close reading. So anyway,
Yeah. Tisk tisk, you're already breaking the format. You're supposed to update us on what you've been
yeah, but
doing
you
before you
said
start
it
talking
was
about
such a great
Francine Prose.
segue. I couldn't help. It's like you pushed me onto the off ramp. I was on the off ramp. Okay, so how's my writing going? Well, maybe the reason I wanted to go ahead and start with the next section is because I don't want to talk about how my writing's going. Um, it is January 8th, 2025, and January 8th seems early in the year, but it's pretty late in the year if you haven't really acted on your New Year's resolution at all. And I want to be more active as a writer. I want to get back into a pattern where I'm writing every day. And it's tough because I'm in the process of moving. We're selling the condo that we live in now, and we're selling everything that we own basically. And it's a tough environment to to write in, but I'm just, I'm making an excuse. Uh, I go back to Ulysses too often, um, but James Joyce wrote Ulysses kind of in a sense, spending 8 years running around Europe, trying to stay away from fascists. And so I don't get to make an excuse that I'm trying to sell my lazy boy. And so it's hard to focus on writing because I don't have a comfortable chair. That's
Yeah,
not an
well,
excuse. That's
I
not
don't
an
know,
excuse I've tried to make. I'm just
I don't
lamenting having to sell my lazy boy.
I don't think that that's maybe I don't know, maybe if that attitude helps you, but also like, you're not James Joyce and neither am I. James, it's an unrealistic standard to hold yourself to.
Uh,
Um,
but we writers can't help it, right? Like, don't you want to be, I don't know, Chekhov?
no. Um, I
Oh,
think
come on. Who
honestly,
doesn't want to be Chekhov?
first of all, if I want to be any writer, it's obviously going to be Dostoevsky. And
Sorry.
I obviously don't want to be Dostoevsky. Like, step one to becoming Dostoevsky is like gamble all of your money away at the casino. Step two is like have a panic attack. Step three is followed by an epileptic seizure. And if that's what it takes to be Dostoevsky, I think I'm good. Um, and I don't know, maybe this is like copium for uh I don't know, my own feelings of inadequacy. But my sense is that if you want to be like a really great writer, you'll also have to go through some really bad stuff. And judged by those standards, I am happy to be kind of in the middle.
Yeah, I hear you.
All
All
right,
right,
do we
so
want
let's
to talk
jump
about
back into
the craft?
let's
Do you want to
jump
start
back
talking
into the
about craft?
format because I want to update you on my writing a bit. My writing group is coming back together. We took a break for Christmas, and we're coming back together. And
Mhm.
one of the things I'm doing, I'm the first writer on deck, uh, and I'm showing how I do a character sketch, and I so my first writing of the year is going to be to take a character sketch I wrote of this character who was kind of very loosely based on this person I knew in high school, and but it was very loosely based on her, so I couldn't just start with that as my character, and and so I wrote it out, and it's maybe 3 paragraphs long, and as I've written, I don't know, 6 or 7, 8, 10,000 words, something like that, of the story, um, I've learned a lot more about her, about my character, and I'm going to rewrite the character sketch. I'm going to use the software Scrivener and write it in the format that Scrivener suggests for character sketches, and just see how that works. I think it's probably going to work pretty well. Um, and so that's where I stand right now. I've got this work I'm struggling to work with because of my lesions in my brain are are changing the way my life works and my brain works, and I'm struggling to figure out how to do things. And I think a part of it is that I'm just going to have to be a lot more organized. I can't carry as many things in my head uh, at the same time, and doing things like having more fleshed out uh, character sketches, I think is a part of that. And so I sort of gave myself that assignment. It's a novel assignment. Typically, we just in our workshop group just read each other's fiction writing, and not any of the supporting documents. And I'm doing a supporting document because I think that's what I need to be focusing on right now.
Mhm.
I'm kind of relearning how to write.
Yeah. given me just an absolutely unfucking hinged idea for what I might do as my craft. I think maybe we can talk about that at the end, but I have some suggestions about how you can do character profiles that we'll talk about later.
Okay,
Um,
I'm looking
anyway,
forward
are
to
we
it.
ready to talk
Don't forget
about
it because I can assure you absolutely
I will not forget
100%
it.
I will forget it. So don't you forget it because I want to hear it. Um,
Well, I won't. Okay. Are we ready to talk about Francine Bros?
sure. Let me get her up on my phone here. Uh, so,
Okay.
uh,
Um, I guess I'll start. I was kind of entertained to notice that I've read at least this chapter before because I recognize her opening preamble as something that I read when I was like, I don't know, maybe like 17. And I literally just straight up remember some of the stuff that she talks about. She talks about reading a novel in French, and French being a language where she needs like a dictionary in order to read, and how that like forced her to practice close reading. On the other hand, there's some stuff that I don't remember. She's super duper anti literary criticism, which I find to just be like goofy and annoying. Um, her the attitude towards literary criticism I find to be goofy and annoying. Um, she describes a she gives a description of the classroom, like the classroom for literary criticism that I, as an English major, just don't recognize. So I'm kind of not sure like what she's on. Like I don't know,
I
maybe literary.
recognize it. I recognize it. I'm a lot older than you, and that was every classroom. It was so heavily politicized that we hardly talked about the text. We hardly talked about
Uh-huh.
the words.
Yeah. Well, nobody talk. I mean, honestly, people don't really do like close readings in these classrooms. And personally, I think that's a good thing. Like close reading is fun, but it's like I don't know, I don't really think that it is a great activity to like spend class time in per se, just because it's like so extremely time consuming. Like it could be that you have one class that's like, we're gonna close read this novel, and that would be great. But honestly, like if I took a class and it was like it's just a general English class, and they're like, great, we're gonna spend all of our class time close reading, I would be fucking pissed off because assuming we have like a normal amount of class time, that means we're gonna read like half a novel this semester, which is not what I would have signed up for in that case. Um, I think it's useful to like close read individual sections, just to like demonstrate the technique. But I also just I don't know, like her attitude towards the literature classroom strikes me as kind of like weirdly anti-intellectual, which is not something that I was expecting.
Well,
Um,
it's very writerly, right? It's more it's she's let me read this paragraph for you.
mhm.
It's one of the things that I noted in the reading. It's about 3 pages in, and she's already written some about how part of how hard it is to teach someone to write. That as a writing teacher, she's always asked, "Can you really teach people to write?" And of course, she can't say no because then she's just a fraud, right? Uh,
Mhm.
she's been stealing money for 20 years, but uh, but also you you kind of can't like you can't teach people how to be a good storyteller, uh, and you can't teach people how to recognize a lyrical sentence versus a uh, poorly crafted, one that falls out of your mouth instead of rolls off the tongue. Um, so anyway, she's talked about that, and she talked about how reading was her real instructor, and reading slowly was how she learned how to write. And at this point, she's finished with her undergraduate degree, and she's started writing a novel. The only time my passion for reading steered me in the wrong direction was when I let it persuade me to go to graduate school. There, I soon realized that my love for books was unshared by many of my classmates and professors. I found it hard to understand that what they did love exactly, and this gave me an anxious shiver that would later seem like a warning about what would happen to the teaching of literature over the decade or so after I dropped out of my PhD program. And this is what you're referring to. That was when literary academia split into warring camps of deconstructionists, Marxists, feminists, and so forth, all battling for the right to tell students that they were reading texts, she puts in quotes, in which ideas and politics trumped what the writer had actually written. I left graduate school and became a writer. That's where she sums up what you were describing. And I I'm 30 years older than you, and I went through undergraduate school 25 years earlier than you did, and I can say at the University of Texas it was like that. Like people weren't doing much talking about how beautifully constructed a paragraph was.
But people don't really talk about that. Like, okay, yeah, I get it. Maybe it was like really, really different than what I experienced. But I don't know, maybe I'm just being a contrarian here. But I actually, I don't know, kind of disagree with her approach. Like, I don't know what label to give it, but this attitude towards writing where it's like it's all about the words, man, and you got to really really think about where you put your commas and whatnot. Like, yeah, that's great. It's nice. Good words, they're good, you know. I like a good word as much as the next guy. And but I just don't think that that is like I think that focusing on that to the exclusion of other stuff that I think is actually just straight up more important is detrimental to writing. I would much rather read a book that has good plot, good characterization, interesting themes, but bad writing than one that has excellent writing and then fails in those other areas.
Yeah, I need to have a talk with your father about this because I really think that these concepts are a lot more intertwined. That the language is where good characterization comes from, and the plot is is uh, is it differs from the story. The narrative differs from the plot only in terms of the way it's revealed in the language, in the word choice, in the syntax, and the
Okay, well, perhaps I need
expressive
to have a
grammar.
discussion with your father because I think what you just said doesn't make any damn sense. Of course the characters are separate from the prose. Like I can see that these things
But they're
to some
not.
extent
How could they
are
be?
intertwined.
Where are
But
they if they're not in the words?
oh my God, it's like saying what are we if not atoms? Chemistry is everything. If you want to
But
study writing, you have to start with chemistry. Like, yes,
I
yes, what you're saying
this
is
is the
technically
second
true.
time we brought up atoms, so it does help to know a bit about chemistry to talk about constructing.
I,
You take your subatomic particles, which I'll call syntax, grammar, and punctuation, and
mhm.
you make your atoms, and then you take your those are words,
Uh-huh.
and then you take your atoms and you put them together in molecules, and those
No,
are
but you're not being
sentences.
fundamental enough. You're not being fundamental enough. If you want to be a good writer, you have to think about paper. I mean, what is a book made out of if not paper and ink? You've got to master those things first.
Um, wow, this is going all over the place, but I want to point out that in her master class, George Carlos um, talks about writing stories that like spiral around the page instead of go left to right, top to bottom. Just be as experimental as you can.
Oh, I
Go to
see.
the most basic elements of structure that you can find and play with them. And I think the most basic elements of structure are not how you line things up on the page. I do find that to be silly, um, but but word choice, syntax, uh, expressive grammar and expressive punctuation. I think that's where everything flows from that. Everything comes from that.
I just don't think that's true, my friend. Um, I also think we speak in a a unfortunately kind of impoverished language, if that's what you want to do, because English grammar is quite inflexible compared to other languages. And you know, if anything, the unique qualities of English prose come precisely from its inflexibility. And what I would say is its like ostensible insuitability to this kind of use. Like on the surface, like Russian is a much more suitable language for this sort of thing because Russian allows you to move the elements around in the sentence with much more freedom than English does. Like in Russian, the grammatical relationships are expressed by case, so you can just put whatever you want at the front of the sentence and whatever you feel like at the end of the sentence. Whereas English doesn't let you do anything nearly so cool. So you're kind of like when you're writing in English, you're writing in a straitjacket, and the things that English is good at are instances where I don't know, people sort of overcome that limitation in an interesting or unique way. And honestly, like
Yeah,
I don't know, like
that's
these
Faulkner.
things.
That's what people talk about when they talk about Faulkner is the sentences he writes where he pulls them apart and puts them together in different ways. And
Mhm.
they're complex, but they actually flow the way thinking flows instead of the way our rules of sentence construction flow.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's thought invoking. Um uh yeah, so do you want to keep going? Because I interrupted you for about 5 minutes
Oh,
on prose.
yeah, I mean, I just think that like I think a focus on prose is valuable, but I think that Francine prose is overstating the case. You know, there's many different elements that go into writing, and prose is one among them, rather than being like the be all end all. And I, I don't know, maybe I think it's actually good, I guess, that we're reading some fiction together as well, because I actually kind of don't understand what you're saying when you claim that like things like characters, characterization, and plot like stem from prose. Because I have just read so many books that are like, wow, this is such a well-written piece of trash, and then I stop reading it. And I have also read many books that are like on a sentence to sentence level, just not the best. Like I could make some line edits and make them better, but the story as a whole is completely unforgettable or very interesting or something like that. So I don't know, these two things seem very separate, and it seems like almost kind of like a fashion that we've just chosen one of the elements of storytelling and we're like, this is the most important one. Every single thing stems from that. And I think you could make an equally plausible case about all of the other elements of storytelling. Like maybe in 20 years, everyone will be talking about how good characters, that's the core of storytelling. And you know what? I would be much more sympathetic to that case than people saying that prose is the
But
origin of
but
everything.
how do you write a good character without good sentences? I mean, I realize that characters say things and do things, and so over time, over the passage of chapters, you can make a good character even if you can't make a good sentence. You can make a compelling and interesting
Yeah.
character. But isn't it more interesting, more compelling, less of a pain in the butt to read if 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 the sentences flow and if
Well,
the
yes. Yes. I mean, uh, I would prefer, all things being equal, that a story have good prose rather than bad prose. But that's not really the attitude that Francine Prose is taking towards this issue. She's not saying prose is a craft element. There you
can we
go.
just call her Francine from now on?
Can we call her Francine? It
So
would
we
make
don't
things less confusing.
Yeah, so we don't use her last name of prose. We'll just call her Francine, okay? Or
Yeah.
Frankie for those who really like her.
Yeah. I feel like I feel like in 20 years, her arch nemesis Francine Plot is going to make like a book arguing for all the opposite things. Um, Yeah, so Francine. No, that just sounds so informal, and it's one of those names where if I just say it, it sounds like I'm like angry at her, Francine. Um, uh, Francine, I mean, her attitude towards this is not that prose is one of the craft elements. It's that prose is the essential craft element, and that everything else stems forth from that, which is, in a certain technical sense, true. But that doesn't like, I think that what she's not like understanding is that the technical truth of that statement doesn't make it actually true.
But yeah, it doesn't make it a valuable thing to say, even if it's true. I understand that, but it is a valuable discussion for us to be having because I think
Hmm.
um, it it like to me the most constructive thing I do now that I'm done with graduate school, the most constructive thing I do for my writing, for learning more about writing, is my writing group,
Hmm.
and in that group we talk about all of these craft elements. Uh, but usually, if you give 30 pages and people respond to it next week in this group, you'll get line edits as well, where people will say, "Hey, this is a great sentence. Like, here's a comment. It's made to make you feel good about yourself. But anyway, here's a great sentence. But here is a paragraph that is poorly written because it keeps taking me out of the story, and I can't get into the character. I can't get into the mood of the character because uh uh I can't get into the mood of the passage. I can't get into the mindset of the character um because I keep seeing the author there looking through the page at me, and it's like they're staring at me and I can't focus on the story. um that's that's a maybe oddly specific example that comes from my own recent experience as the author in the hot seat of my group. But the fact is, you need all of it to do a good job. You've got to be able to write something that someone can read at a pace with a fluency uh, that 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 reveals a plot that if you're going for a compelling plot, it's compelling. Or if you're trying to get insight into characters who are rich 3D characters who you no longer think of as characters at the end of your reading experience of the book, you think of them as people. That's how richly carved they are. Um, it, you know, those are all things that we need to be able to do as writers. Um, but we learn to do those things, I believe, by by learning about the sentence. Um, that's so much in the narration of a plot, or let me put it this way: in the laying out of a story, uh, in the laying out of a story. So much of it is in what is only hinted at and what is not revealed in its place in time, but is revealed later or is foreshadowed earlier. So much of that is built in in at the sentence level. And if we want to build that well, if we want to foreshadow without just giving something away, like not holding up a sign that says this guy has a dark soul, not holding up a sign that says that, but showing just a hint of that darkness. Uh, that's an easy thing to screw up if you want to show a hint of darkness and you let too much darkness out. Um, and that's all about how you write that sentence, how you form that paragraph, where you let that darkness peek out from behind the closet door for just a second. There, I think I've made my case as eloquently as I can, and let's move along. Because I'm going to close on a win because I feel like that was a good comment.
Hmm. Hmm. Well. Let's move on.
That was my way of saying that. That was a good last word. Don't try to one up me on that. Um, yeah. So, uh,
Are we ready for Borges?
yeah, I guess so. I'd kind of like to conclude with her concluding chapter. I mean, with her concluding bits of that chapter, and uh, and we're pausing so that I can find this. I guess we're going to cut this part out, right?
No, I
No,
don't.
I,
I
I
don't
don't. I
recommend
don't think
making.
we're not like that.
I don't
We're
recommend making any edits whatsoever.
yeah,
Like
and
this should be the
and
extent of your editing. If there's a long pause at the beginning or at the end of this discussion, you should cut that out, and you should seriously consider not doing that. Okay, someone is ringing my doorbell, which is very unusual, so I'm gonna go
yeah.
check.
Go see if the
My
building's
neighbors
on
might need
fire.
something.
I'll I'll
Uh,
I'll I'll
Probably not
I'll
on fire.
I'll keep the meeting going for a bit. So James is getting up. I guess he's wearing his underwear, nice underwear. James is getting it's Christmas present for me, I think actually. Uh James is getting up to check his door because his door is being knocked on or his doorbell is being rung. And the reason that's urgent, even though it's 9 o'clock in the morning for me, it's 9 o'clock at night for him. And James, if you haven't figured this out, is my son. And James, as you probably do not know, lives in a fucking war zone. And occasionally they get bombed, and occasionally they have to go down into the uh, basement to try to not die in case one of the bombs hits them. Uh, uh,
Yeah, okay, let's not be dramatic. If it was bombs, I would hear about it on my phone.
yeah, and also you
There's
probably
a
hear some
there's a pretty
bombs, but yeah,
robust advanced warning system.
yeah.
Um, and
James lives
also
in Kiev, by the way.
there's also a very I don't know, it's just not as dangerous or interesting as it sounds. Nobody was there. I think my doorbell must just be like positioned in a spot where people think it's my neighbor's doorbell or something. Um, Very annoying. And also, I was looking forward to maybe getting to talk to Svetlana, my neighbor. Um,
Practice
okay,
your practice your Russian or your Ukrainian son. Mm. All right, so let me finish. I found this paragraph. Um, she is talking about learning to write by doing close reading of various authors. Just everything that you read with close reading, and I do that now. I read like Frankie, let's call her, taught me how to read again, and and uh, uh, and now I read everything like this, and I mean everything. It drives everyone around me crazy. Me
I can confirm.
like shoe boxes, the language on shoe boxes. I'm looking at how it's all put together and not just trying to figure out what color the laces are. Okay. Um, to be truthful, there are writers who will stop you dead in your tracks by making you see your own work in the most unflattering light. As you said, we are not James Joyce. Each of us will meet a different harbinger of personal failure. Mr. Joyce, meet Mr. Morgan. Uh, each of us will meet a different harbinger of personal failure, some innocent genius chosen by us for reasons having to do with what we see as our own inadequacies. The only remedy to this, and what she means by this is a showstopper, like, oh my God, this writing is so amazing. I can't learn from it. I'm just so intimidated by it that I can't do it. I can't write. That's the feeling that she's talking about. The only remedy to this I have found is to read another writer whose work is entirely different from the first, though not necessarily more like your own. A difference that will remind you of how many rooms there are in the house of art. And one of the reasons I wanted to read that is because I knew that you were going to say this stuff about the sentences don't matter. Um, and it's not the first time we've had this discussion. And the other one was, it's such a nice segue to to our writing today, because it's or to our reading, uh, because
The fiction, you mean?
yeah, the fiction, because it's talking about how many rooms there are in the houses of art, and Borges talked some about all these rooms, and there's all these different types of approaches to reading, and all these different you know types of writing, uh, segmented, and it becomes tedious, and most of it is meaningless. Uh, and I think she is writing about that same kind of truth, that that you have to find the part of it, of the world of writing, that speaks to you, and it might not be the same part that spoke to you 10 years ago. That's also something that Borges talks about, is how that character has found different uh, hexagons to spend time in, or to manage as they've aged.
Yeah, so before we start talking about the fiction, I think we should actually introduce it, just because
Go for it.
some people may have actually read the story or might want to you know read along or something. Okay, so the fiction that we're reading, the fiction that we've already read, is The Library of Babel by Borges. And honestly, I kind of picked this story to fuck with you a little bit because it's very unusual. It's kind of difficult to talk about in terms of craft elements, because like the prose is written in the style of like a literary Wikipedia article. And the narrative style never really breaks that frame. There are also not really any events. There's not really any characters. There is a narrator. That's about the closest you get to having a character. There are a couple of people who are mentioned but not named. It really, I mean, a literary Wikipedia article. I don't think I'm going to get much better in terms of
No,
describing what it's like to read
that's a great description.
uh, read this story. And
It's let me read the first sentence, in case people haven't, but first let me find it. uh Sorry, you need to say something clever while I'm doing this.
okay, sure, I'll work on it. I think that the other thing about this story is like other Borges stories. I've been meaning to read more Borges. I've heard a lot of them are like this, but uh, like other Borges stories, or so I've heard, around a single thought that is kind of explored in this literary framework. But equally, it almost feels like this story could have been an essay instead of being a short story. And I don't know. I guess it's quite interesting for that, because, like I said, there's not a whole lot that you like. It's difficult to pull out less like craft lessons from this story, because unless you're planning to write a short story that reads like a literary Wikipedia article, this story straight up might not have that much for you.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot in here. I was two-thirds of the way through this before I found something that I could even call story.
Hmm.
Right? I did find the story, and the story is the characters. The only, I mean, there's not really a three-dimensional character. There's only this character who provides the narration, um, who lives in and manages a part of the library. And
Hmm.
for background, the library, well, I'll just read the first couple of sentences. Um, and then I'll tell you why they're awful, and then I'll tell you why I like them. Here we are, the Library of Babel. The universe, parentheses open, which others call the library, parentheses closed, is composed of an indefinite, perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries. In the center of each gallery is a ventilation shaft bounded by a low railing. From any hexagon, one can see the floors above and below, one after another, endlessly. The arrangement of the galleries is always the same. 20 bookshelves, 5 to each side, line 4 of the hexagon's 6 sides. The height of the bookshelves, floor to ceiling, is hardly greater than the height of a normal librarian. I love some of those descriptions, like that thing, that last sentence, that description of how tall the bookshelves are. The narrator is a character, right? Always, and from my perspective, is always a character, and that's such a great bit of characterization, and it is what I'm talking about with sentences and word choice, and what you don't say by saying something around it. Uh, uh, that this character describes the height of a bookshelf by comparing it to the height of a normal librarian. Like that tells us so much about how this person thinks. This characters, the way the character's mind works. So I think that there is character, but it's done so subtly, and it's so rich. This one character, I think, becomes a very rich character. You can't suss out nearly so much plot from this, but there is a story with the plot that you can explain in one sentence, but there is a story here of this narrator spending decades in the library, and how their relationship with the library has changed over their decades in the library, and how humanity's relationship with the library has changed over those decades. Because at first there was a greater concentration of people in the library, right? And then fewer and fewer people were in the library, so each person in the library sort of had more ground to cover to keep the library. And you know, also halfway through reading this, or maybe 1/3 of the way through reading this, I thought, well, here's the weirdest comparison that I'm ever going to come up with that people are going to think is stupid, and that is that this is kind of like one of those super short Hemingway short stories, like the 1,000 to 1,500 word short stories. I read them, I loved them, they were so valuable to me. But I realized that they're all just kind of puzzles, and you have to figure them out. And there's too much work to figure them out. It's too challenging. It's not a dialogue. It's like the author is hiding something from me, not revealing something to me. And it's fine for that to happen occasionally, but it's like that's all that's happening, is the author is hiding something from me. So it is a struggle to find out what this is about. And at the end, I came up with what it's about, the Library of Babel, because there were no other possibilities. But in both cases, in those Hemingway 49 short stories, and in this piece, it seems like we've been written into a puzzle. Yeah, the language is
Yeah.
different. Yeah, Hemingway would never write a sentence like that, like any of those sentences I just read. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm just going to say we're two sentences into the story and we have parentheses, we have nouns being capitalized in expressively different ways than our you know our 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 third grade teacher would tell us was correct. We have M dash, ellipses. We have the M dash used in two different ways. Uh,
Oh yeah,
we
that's for
have
sure.
we
That's my
have things,
boy.
yeah, and we have quotes used kind of to express the sort of mundane choice of words within the quotes, sort of like as an apology. Um, and then we also have them used as like uh, James gave me some candy uh, for Christmas, and it was fancy chocolate, and that would be like, I know what fancy chocolate is. James gave me something because he knows I like fancy chocolate, but it was just some crap. But fancy chocolate. By the way, none of that happened. I'm just, I'm just talking and trying
Yeah.
to come up with an
What
analogy, and it failed.
what is
Um,
it that you came up with that the story is like about?
so it's about his passage, the passage of his life in. So if I had to decode it and say, wow,
Mhm.
what is he talking about that actually applies to a world where the library is not infinite and it's just uh, it doesn't have every possible combination of 410. It's 410 pages. Every novel was 400, a book was 410 pages, 40 lines of text, roughly 80 characters on each line. Uh, and what 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 does his the little bit of story that we have of the way his relationship, I'm saying their relationship changed over time with the library. What does that say about the world I live in? Like,
Mhm.
how's that how's that relevant to me? And so I just map his story, that story, on top of what what I see, and that is the world of words has gotten smaller, uh, and it's getting smaller. And words, there's so much can be said in books, and it's so easy to say things in books if you just sit down and start writing. And so most of what's said in books is gibberish, but also the things that we live for can be found in books, even if it's much harder to find those things in people. Love can be found in books. You can find love in people, but it takes a lot more work. Um, uh,
Hmm.
and but that world is collapsing. And as far as I know, he's writing this at the time when uh, what is this, like 25 years after we started having movies with sound, and televisions are fairly common now. Uh, we haven't yet had the Olympics broadcast in color, but we're not far off. Uh, um, uh, we have our first tyrant who's come to power 10 years before in Germany, come to power, I think 10 years before this was published. I think it was published in the early 40s, right? Am I
I have
right
no
about
idea.
that? Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just going to go with that. Don't look it up because I might be wrong. Um, and and Hitler was such uh, a um, he was driven by AV, right? His speeches. It's not just the people who are in the audience; it's the people who saw it on screens across Germany, uh, that passion was such an important part of his rise to power, and you know, his stranglehold, his eventual stranglehold on the country. So just the written word was falling away at the time that he was writing this. The value, or um uh the central placement of the library um in life uh was falling away as he's writing this. And so I think that that's kind of the plot of this young person who finds this infinite gallery of language, and the world doesn't see it the same way, and this young person just stays in the library and realizes, you know, all the issues with it, like 99% of it is gibberish. That's one of the problems.
Hmm.
uh it speaks to fewer and fewer people. That's another one of the problems. The population is thinning out in the library.
You
uh
see, but I think I don't know. I think that the reading that you're articulating here is really different than one that I've heard before. And I think it's because you're looking really hard for a plot where I don't think there's really supposed to be any. Like I think the plot that does exist is incidental to him being like, let me tell you about this weird ass thing that I thought of. Because I really don't I don't know. It's weird. Normally, I wouldn't say this sort of thing about a story, but I feel like this is not really like I don't think he really wants us to be thinking about the written word as a whole. I think he's more gesturing towards um I guess the library isn't infinite, so I can't say he's gesturing towards the infinite, but he is gesturing towards this weird property that language has, or that written language has, or that this property that like gibberish has, which is that we can imagine a frame from which these things make sense. And actually, I think we should maybe back up and just sort of describe what the library is for anyone who doesn't know. So this the
well,
core
first of all, for
idea.
anyone who doesn't know, this short story, if we're going to call it a short story, it's very easy to find and it's very short. Just Google it.
Yeah,
Library of Babel.
like 8 pages long.
Yeah, it's a quick read.
But anyway, the basic idea is that there's a library, and he gives the set sort of parameters for the length of book that's in a library. It's like a 410 pages long, 40 lines of 80 characters a piece, and those lines, and within the library, which is very, very large, every possible combination of book with those parameters exists. And so the vast majority of books are just complete gibberish, but every possible book that you could imagine that fits within those parameters is contained within the library. And so the library, which is like very easy to imagine and to understand, has some really strange properties as a result of just the fact that it sort of contains everything. One of them that I think is interesting and sort of easy to overlook is that you said earlier most of the library is gibberish, and from any one point of view, that absolutely makes sense. But Borges actually sort of lingers on the idea. I think one of the sort of like heretical sects has this concept, right? Which is that sure, it's gibberish to you, but perhaps if you spoke some other language that is yet to exist, this particular book would be intensely meaningful and would be, you know, maybe it would contain your life story if you only spoke the language that it's written in. And so he goes well beyond the sort of initial things that you would think of that this library has as properties. Like, oh man, isn't it spooky that this library has, you know, every single book. One of the things that he talks about that so I've taught my students this story. And this is one that I think is really dumb, but it sure does get the attention of 14-year-olds. is that the library contains the true life story of every living person. And someone has created a digital equivalent of the Library of Babel. So you can go on this website and you can say and be absolutely correct in saying that this website contains your life story, including the parts that haven't happened yet. And when I said that to a bunch of 14-year-olds, I don't know, they looked at me like I just told them that I, have a secret time machine in my apartment. Um, and it takes them a while to understand how that can even be true. But it absolutely is. There's a website out there right now that contains your entire life story. Um, and he goes even beyond that. Like he talks about the way that there must be so many, sure, the library contains your life story, but it also contains all sorts of false life stories, and the false life stories vastly outnumber the true life stories. But uh, equally, the library must contain a book that explains truthfully which of these stories is the false ones and which ones are the negative ones. And he takes this principle very, very far in coming up with like weird implications that this place has.
Yeah, he spirals down that like similar rabbit hole 4 or 5 times about the way that the texts kind of referred to each other. I really liked, and all of those touch on ways of reading. I think I really like the part where there's the book that is just MCV over and over and over again, and you can certainly see it as gibberish, but maybe if you look at the MCV on line, I'm making up these numbers, but line 8 of page 240, the context is a little different. Am I zooming in and out, or is that just it's the thing about
Yeah,
Zoom?
I don't know. I think Zoom is just doing something.
Yeah, I got to work on those settings. Anyway, the context of the MCV on line 8 of page 240 is such that it's a different MCV than the first one that you read. And sure, that's got to be true, except no one gets to page 240 of a text. It's you start on like halfway through the first paragraph and you start flipping through to see if it's actually all MCV, and it is. So I don't know what that means, or what he meant it to mean, but what it means to me is we can take literary criticism to a point that it's both useless and kind of incomprehensible.
Mhm.
And he didn't spend a lot of time on the MCV book, but it's stuck in my head, and it seems like it's stuck in yours based on how much you smiled when I brought it up. And I don't know, I find that to have some resonance with Francine Prose, with Frankie's sort of stop talking with these professors who just want to talk about the politics of a work, and read the writers who write well. It kind of felt like that, like dismissing everything about the writing that wasn't the actual language.
Mhm.
I'm not saying it well, but it felt, or it read to me like a value judgment that took political content out of the text, or at least look down on the idea that the political content is an important part of the text.
No, I didn't read that
It's
section
in a
that way at
different
all.
context. Well, let me get this point out, and then I'll be quiet for a long time. because I want to drink my smoothie. Um, uh, it's a different point of view in defense of Francine. It's a different point of view because she's writing about how to make yourself into a good writer, into an effective writer, or maybe a profitable writer. I don't know, a writer that you're happy to be. She's writing for writers, and he is writing for readers, I guess, or for himself. I don't know. But he's writing for readers, uh, and the reader, I think, is more likely to be open to the idea that that the politics of a work are just another way that people find of corrupting language, or find of a slight elaboration on just straight up gibberish, slightly more comprehensible than straight up gibberish. That's sort of how I read it. That both writers were Prose and Borges, Francine, were looking down on this richer reading of books, I'll say, that I think might serve someone who's trying to learn how to write good sentences, but doesn't serve someone who is trying to be a reader who uses reading as a way of enriching their life, or being a writer who writes complex, enriching stories.
Mhm.
I guess I'm turning 180 degrees and agreeing with you about that issue
Finally.
that you had with Francine.
All it took was the most insane short story ever written by man. So I mean, I didn't read the section about that. What is it, like MCF book?
MCV.
MCV. I didn't read the section about the MCV book that way at all, because I think what he's getting at is he's really trying to sort of enrich the library by pointing out ways in which what initially appears to us as gibberish can, in fact, simply be a profoundly significant message that we are simply incapable of understanding. And his point is a little bit like kind of similar, but a little bit different from the point that he makes earlier about how some books might just be, a very important book just written in a language that you don't understand. And he's pointing to a book that is clearly not written in any natural human language. Like there's no human language that, where MCV written over and over and over again for 410 pages can be any kind of message. But perhaps it's written in some kind of code, Perhaps this MCV thing is some kind of code. And if we only knew the rules to the code, we would understand that there's actually a great deal of variety here. That MCV written over and over again, if we only have the code to decipher it into what it's really supposed to mean, actually signifies something really important. I don't know, like the biography of the archangels or something. And in fact, to take it one step further, I think this is a using Borges' own method. MCV, in fact, must be some kind of code, a code that is described somewhere in the library. And not only must it be some sort of code, it must be an infinite number of codes that describes all of the most important things that we would like to look for. One of the ideas that he gets at here is that the library, I find it so interesting that it's not actually infinite. In previous readings, that has kind of gone over my head. I've just kind of, I guess, simplified the largeness of the library into, okay, this thing is infinite. But in fact, it's not infinite. It contains every possible book only one time. And there's all sorts of stuff that you would want to look for. And what's interesting is that there are so many permutations of each one of those books that when we just think of the sheer number of them, that there must be, it seems impossible that we would not, run into one of them. If you're looking for your own true life story, well, for every, for there's only one book that is the absolutely true life story of you, including the parts that haven't happened yet. However, there are a very large number of books that are the true life story of you, but with one character changed. And there's, a lot more of them that are the true life story, but with two characters changed, and then three and four, and so on and so forth. And eventually we get to a point where there's like billions and billions and maybe trillions of books out there that more or less describe your life as it's going to happen. Um, but within the context of a library that contains every possible permutation of book, uh, we're talking about a very large number that is subsumed by a significantly larger number, and with no way for us to possibly, as human beings, distinguish what is like valuable and important information from what is not valuable and important information. And I think Borges wants us to take this thought in kind of two different directions at once, right? The first is that, well, maybe that is the curse and the limitation of being human, right? Is that we are surrounded by all of this extremely valuable information with no way to pick out the valuable information. And I think he would equally want us to say that we're surrounded, because the thing is, right? Your life story, the thing that he does with languages makes this really interesting, because your life story, your true life story, let's say that's something that you want to find. Well, assuming that you spoke the right language and you had the right code for interpreting that book, you must be already standing in like extreme close proximity to one of the versions of that story that's just written in a weird and confusing way. And you simply lack the language skill and you lack the code to understand what's right in front of you. So on the one hand, I think he wants us to view these books as extremely rare, and at the same time, which is equally true, wants us to understand that if you're looking for your own complete life story, well, every single book in the library is your own complete life story. You just need to be able to interpret that book in a particular way, which you unfortunately don't have access to. Okay, I'm realizing now that I've started talking that I have truly picked a very strange story for us to look at in terms of craft elements, because it's like, yes, these are all very interesting ideas, but this doesn't like this doesn't really do anything for us in terms of like what you can pick out and use as a writer, unless you want to write like a Borges style literary Wikipedia article, which I guess I will probably try my hand at eventually. There's not a lot here that you can take home and use in your like normal short story that is about people doing things.
Yeah, speaking of that, you're a high school teacher. You assign this to your students?
Yeah.
That's cruel.
Why?
What grade did you teach this in?
Ninth grade.
Oh yeah, you're a terrible human being.
Why?
No, I'm playing. It's just not
At any age, the children are ready to begin contemplating the infinite.
yeah.
I would
Okay.
assign it in middle school if I thought I could.
So what you're saying is this is like 3 steps above I love you all the way to the moon and back.
Yes.
Okay. Um I want to point out first of all that he is speaking of middle school language arts. He his characters are limited to 22 orthographic characters. I guess those are letters. I don't know which ones we don't get to use, but those are
Yeah.
letters.
The really interesting, there's like so many tantalizing details, like the 410 pages.
Yeah,
Um, the alphabet is missing some letters, I guess.
yeah, and also no. Uh, the only punctuation marks are periods and commas. So it's those 22 orthogonal characters plus the empty space plus periods plus commas, and that's it. And then in his first paragraph, we get everything. Parentheses. I mean, obviously we get capital letters. The library doesn't have capital letters,
Yeah,
but
I hadn't made that connection, but it does kind of feel like he's fucking with us there.
yeah, like he uses the M dash in two different ways in the first paragraph.
Bro's
I don't know how
in
you can get high school ninth graders to read this without feeling at least some degree of guilt.
I'm a cruel, cruel person. That's how.
Yeah, semicolons, colons, the 4-period ellipsis to end the sentence and start a new idea. Yeah, quotation marks used in different ways. It's a lot for a man who for a character who has lived his life in a library that doesn't have any of those grammatical marks
Yeah.
to be writing with.
You know, there are also some other places where he kind of ostentatiously draws attention to, I guess, the artificiality of the story. Because, you know, on the one hand, he seems to take great pains to like allow us to imagine this as a story that is being written in this setting. Because this character is writing within the margins of these books that exist. Like the only thing that exists is the library. There's not some like, I don't know, like post office he can go to like buy stationery to write out his account. Um, but at the same time, he includes characters that this character wouldn't have access to, such as the semicolon. What kind of heretic would go and invent a semicolon in this setting? The other thing is he makes it very clear that the library is not like a part of our world. This is a completely separate world. This is a universe. This is a universe that we, you know, are not connected to. There's no like France in this universe. And yet there's one section when he starts talking about languages, he refers to like existing natural languages in the real world. Like he talks about like I don't know, I think Portuguese. Yeah, he talks about
Portuguese and
which
Yiddish.
is by the
like
Portuguese
there's
is,
an argument. There's an argument over whether or not a particular passage in a particular book is written in Portuguese or Yiddish.
yeah. Portuguese is really fucking funny as a language for him to bring up, by the way, because the original language of this story is Spanish. And so you have to imagine that like I don't know, Portuguese is the go-to language where like if you're a native speaker of Spanish and you're reading something and it's completely fucking incomprehensible to you, you go, maybe that's Portuguese.
Yeah.
And
It's like either that's Portuguese or I am high. It's one of those
yeah.
two.
So it's I don't know, it's just really funny to be like have these characters see something that's like completely incomprehensible and be like, maybe it's Portuguese.
Or maybe it's Yiddish.
Yeah.
You know, something that we didn't mention is the footnotes. Like short stories don't usually have footnotes.
Love me a good footnote. Honestly, I think we need to start using them. I think footnotes, very underutilized technique in
fiction.
Short stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, just wait till I make you read House of Leaves.
So I want to read one of the footnotes. It's actually from that section that you were just talking about with the Portuguese and the Yiddish. It's the paragraph after that concludes. Some 500 years ago, the chief of this is not the footnote, but it's where the footnote refers to. Some 500 years ago, the chief of one of the upper hexagons. Remember, the hexagons are the rooms in the library. Some 500 years ago, the chief of one of the upper hexagons, footnote, came across a book as jumbled as all the others, but containing almost 2 pages of homogeneous lines. That's where they start arguing about the language it's in. And the footnote is, in earlier times, there was one man for every 3 hexagons. suicide and diseases of the lung have played havoc with that proportion. So I'm thinking about suicide and diseases of the lung. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that just sounds like sort of a random thing. But also, is he commenting on how people who are very readerly tend to kill themselves at a higher frequency and also smoke at a higher frequency? Is that what that's all about? The diseases of the lung and the suicide? An unspeakable melancholy memory, colon. I have sometimes traveled for nights on end down corridors and polished staircases without coming across a single librarian. And here he's talking about, I get the sense he's talking about recently, he can spend so much time and not find a single person who cares about language in the way that he thinks language should be cared about. Go ahead, tell me I'm reading way too much into it.
No. You just, you know, I don't think that your reading is like unsustainable, but I do think it's just funny. I think it's it's very different to make this story about, um, you know, how reading is so like important, how literary culture is going away. Because
It's
I
an
don't know,
infinite library where the population is thinning out to nothing.
yes, well, I don't think it's thinning out to nothing. I just think that, I don't know. I guess I haven't really thought about what he means by that particular detail, but I think the thing is that like the the story is so focused on the concept of the infinite. And I don't know, I think it's and also like the story, like for instance, the suicide thing, right? Suicide and disease of the lung. I don't know why it's disease of the lungs rather than like disease of the bowels. Maybe he just doesn't want us to imagine these librarians shitting themselves to death. But I think the suicide thing is more just about like the way that when you contemplate this sort of infinitely meaningful but also infinitely meaningless type of thing, it just, I don't know, doesn't that make you want to kill yourself? Like that makes sense to me. um
Yeah, sure.
i I really don't think like I don't know, the thing that bothers me about this reading is that it's very like grounded, you know, like
It's very what?
it's very grounded. Like to me, I think it is almost it's very clear to me anyway that what Borges wants us thinking about here is his crazy fucking library and like what does it mean for like an infinitely a randomly generated assortment of I keep using the word infinite, but the library is not fucking infinite. I need some other word for it. This space
Practically infinite.
that contains every single text. What does that mean? What does it signify? What does it like the fact that this is even something that we can think about, like, what does that mean for us? I think that's what he wants us to be focused on. And I don't know, I'm not trying to like insult you, but I think your reading kind of impoverishes the text because he wants us thinking about like God, you know, and to what extent is meaning itself like an aspect of God. And your reading is like, isn't it a shame that people don't read books anymore? And you know what?
Yeah.
The thing
And
is,
he
I don't think it's
refers,
an unsustainable reading. Like there are some details here that I think are hard to explain any other way. Um, but that doesn't mean I like it.
um, I want to read, uh, let me see, is this the very end? Yes, he does talk, about, God in here as like, bringing this concept of the infinite and God together, I think. At the same time, he says a couple of times, like, yeah, I know the math. You can, you know, take 25 characters to the power of, 80. And that's how many possibilities you have in just the first line
Ah, but
of
I I think another thing that he mentions that's interesting is he speaks about the population in terms of density, right? And so one point
Hmm.
that he makes, which I think is kind of crucial here, is that whatever book you're looking for, there's a very high likelihood that someone has read it. They also start talking about religious concepts, which I find very interesting because at this point, once they start talking about this religious concept, I think we're getting into questions of the upper limits of what a book can even do. And I want to connect this to something like just a little bit of like brain candy that I've had like floating around in my head for a while. I've kind of thought about this sort of idea, right? Of like okay, it's a little bit of a morbid idea, but the concept is that I feel like most things that I could believe, anything that I could imagine myself, like even conceptually, I could imagine myself believing. I think there's probably some combination of words that someone could say to me that would convince me of that belief. I think just merely by the fact of me being able to imagine a state of my mind where that's something that I can believe, there's probably some combination of words out there that could convince me of that opinion. I think at this point I've unlocked the like Borges part of my brain by having this thought. And so anyway, I just kind of wanted to share that before we start talking about some of the like really weird stuff that he mentions. So one of the ideas he has is that there must be, and at this point, we're not talking about stuff that actually must be in the library. It's more of a like conceptual religious leap. But there must be some book out there that grants someone a total and accurate understanding of the library. And even if we can see that there must be a nearly infinite number of imposter books that tell you that they do that, but they don't really do that, there must be one such book that actually does give you a full, complete, true understanding of this whole fucking library. And because there are, enough librarians spread out across this place that there's only, I don't know, like 1,000 books per librarian, there's a very high chance that if that book exists, that someone actually has read it. And he specifically names that person as God. He's like, that person, by dint of having read that book, must have achieved godhood. Um, which is a really interesting idea, and I think it's one that opens up a realm of like kind of weird, bizarro theological debate that I like don't even really know what to do with. um,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of saying if the librarian knows everything about your life that you have not found yet and that you have experienced, all the shit you've forgotten, all the backstory that you didn't ever know, even, all of that, that person is God. They know your past, present, and future all better than you do.
mm. But he goes further than that, right? Because the one true book, it's not just a book that tells you. I mean, I guess in some sense it is a book that tells you everything, because what he's imagining is a book that would enable you, like a codex, that would enable you to locate any other book of importance that you're trying to find. And one such book, if it's possible to like have it, exist in book shape, it must exist. And even conceding that there must be an infinite number of, or a nearly infinite number of false copies, there must be a real copy that actually does what it says it does, just by sheer coincidence. And if someone
Yeah.
happens to pick up that book, they would gain the infinite knowledge contained within the library, which I don't know. It's fucking weird. It's a fucking weird thought.
Yeah. I didn't, I guess I stumbled past, the language is so dense, or so not dense, but convoluted in some ways, that
Yeah.
I stumbled past some of these ideas. And I remember that one, but I went past it pretty quickly. And I think it was, he didn't put many paragraphs into it.
Hmm.
Uh, Yeah. Um, I think we should probably wrap up since this is now about 4 times as long as we were saying it was
Yeah,
going to be.
I was about to say, like, we've gone way longer than we intended to. The other thing is, I think part of the consequences of me choosing such a weird, short story, we haven't really talked about like how you, we haven't really talked about this from the perspective of like reading it like a writer. We've just been talking about the ideas, locked in the story, and yeah, I don't know. I don't even really want to talk about the prose here, or like how to read the story like a writer. I think this is a very, very useful story if you're trying to write these sort of like philosophical parables. This story will tell you, if you look at it very, very closely, it'll give you an idea of how to do that. But I don't think very many people are interested in writing philosophical parables. But you know, if you are, maybe give the Library of Babel a very close read.
And and I'll throw my conclusion in that uh, with all of this like weirdly constructed language, Borges kind of answers our argument, solves our argument for us about how important this careful composition of sentences is in writing books that are effective. I'm going to read. I'm going to read the first sentence of the second to the last paragraph of the main section of this story. Methodical composition distracts me from the present condition of humanity. It seems like at least when he wrote that sentence, he was siding with you. Just don't try so hard, and maybe you'll find out. Like you'll find humanity if you just don't try so hard. Here's another point on it. It's like he got to the end and he says, "Okay, now I'm going to tell you all these things about this thing I've just written and you've just read." The certainty that everything has already been written annuls us or renders us phantasmal.
Hmm.
And here's one that speaks to our current politics. I know districts in which the young people prostrate themselves before books and, like savages, kiss their pages, though they cannot read a letter. Epidemics, heretical discourse.
Sounds like church.
Yeah. Yeah. Or a political rally. Epidemics, heretical discords, pilgrimages that inevitably denigrate into a brigandage had decimated the population. I guess that word brigandage, and probably saying it incorrectly. Sorry?
Brigandage. It's
Brigandage?
brigandage.
All right, thank you.
It means being a brigand, i.e., like a criminal.
Yeah. So yeah, had decimated the population. I believe I mentioned the suicides, which are more and more frequent every year. All right, I'm going to read this sentence. I'm going to go out with this sentence because we talked about complex sentence structures and English being used in its prescribed ways and how restricted that can be. I'm going to read this sentence and I'm going to speak the punctuation marks and capital letters aloud, because most of those punctuation marks and those capital letters are not allowed in the library. So I'm going to speak them aloud, and I'm going to read the sentence and then I'll stop talking about this fantastic story that you brought us to. I am perhaps misled by old age and fear, comma, but I suspect that the human species, in dash, the italics only species, in dash, teeters on the verge of extinction, yet that the capital L library, in dash, enlightened, comma, solitary, comma, infinite, comma, perfectly unmoving, comma, armed with precious volumes, comma, pointless, comma, incorruptible, comma, and secret, M dash will endure, period. So that is an amazing, and I realize that sentence, I guess that sentence is in translation, right? But that is an amazing sentence because it made perfect sense to me the first time I read it. And it probably didn't make sense to anyone who has been with us for these 2 hours and listened to me read it aloud. But the first time I read it, I was able to follow exactly what he was saying. And that's because he took a long sentence. I believe it's because he took a long sentence and he cut it up and put it in the order of the thought and not the order of the grammar that we were taught. And by cutting it up and putting it in the order of the thought, we had to use all these special grammatical, all this punctuation to glue it all together in one sentence. And I know I can hear my 10th grade English teacher, Ann Georgian, saying, no, you need more sentences, like separate that into multiple sentences. But he did that for a reason. I don't know, the complexity of language or something. Okay, let's wrap it up. There's actually someone on the other side of the room doing this. So I think we need to wrap it up.
Sounds good. I think we can decide, not right now what we're gonna read next time. So I don't know. I don't really have any good idea for how to outro this. Maybe we just end it. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. We could both start smoking something. That's part of it, right? The people in the library, smokers. Yeah, or maybe we could just let's say this. This is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about our writing progress for the week. We're going to talk about a reading on craft, on writing, that is maybe 10 pages to 30 pages long, and we're going to talk about a work or a part of a work of fiction that is like 10 to 30 pages long, and we're going to do that every week. And hopefully we're going to get it down to 30 minutes. But
I doubt it. I doubt we will do that based on what happened today.
Well, hopefully it won't be 2 hours in the future. Anyway, that's us. That's it. And we're going to come up with a name for it too. Now I'm going to stop the recording.